Welcome, everybody. I am recording this. Welcome to Earth Day Every Day. This is the third webinar in this series in the fall. Thank you for joining us, and thank you if you also joined us in the spring. We hope you're enjoying our webinar series, but I am Amy Rowe. I am the Rutgers Cooperative Extension Agent for Essex and Passaic. I'll be hosting today. I'm joined by some fellow agents. Michelle Backus and Steve Virgio are helping me with the chat. And we have our speaker, Bill Hlubik from Middlesex County. I'll introduce him formally in a minute, but I need to go through some housekeeping issues, so please bear with me for a minute. So again, just remember that this is being recorded and the chat is recorded, so please behave yourselves. Also, I wanted to let you know about the chat. Please put any questions that you have or comments for the speaker in the chat box. It should be in the bottom right corner of your control panel. It should look like a little cartoon conversation bubble. And if you click on that, your chat should show up on the right-hand side and you can type in there. Be aware that everyone can see the questions you're asking unless you specifically send it only to specific peoples like the host or the presenter. But yeah, we'll be answering questions as we go, so please don't be shy. And we'll be answering those questions, and we'll be trying to get to as many questions as possible, but please have patience because there's a lot of material to cover as we go through all of this. So, just so you know what Rutgers Cooperative Extension is, we are the outreach arm of the university. So we bring research and knowledge from the university out into the community level. We do lots of work with counties and municipalities, but we also help homeowners, farmers, the general public with all kinds of issues between agricultural, environmental, excuse me, and then we also have 4-H, which you might be aware of as the youth development arm. And then we also have family and community health sciences. So Rutgers Cooperative Extension is we're here when you need us, and we're still working despite the pandemic. So thanks for checking in with us. So again, just to remind you of what we're doing here, Earth Day Every Day is to provide you with some information on all of these topics, but then we are also providing you with some actions that you can do to be more sustainable at home. So you're trying to conserve resources. We're trying to be responsible in terms of what we're doing in the environment and in the community. So this webinar series is giving you some practices and tips that you can use at home to be as sustainable as possible. And thank you, Bill, for advancing the slide. I wanted to let you all know that towards the end of this presentation, we're going to have a poll that you can answer to give us some information about what you learned about this program, what you learned, what you thought, what you plan to do in terms of actions at your own home. And so in order to be in compliance with all of our regulatory agencies, because you are human subjects, we need your consent to partake in this research study. So it's a research study that is just giving us information about the quality of this program, what you thought of the program, comments, and then what you learned. And so at the beginning of the poll, you will be asked to give your consent to partake in the study. So this is what all of the legal stuff that you see here in front of you. You do not have to take part in the study if you don't want to, but we do value your feedback and would appreciate your participation. So also be aware that we have we are providing this programming free of charge, but we do have the ability to take donations, and any support that you can give to us would be wonderful. I will put all of the information in the chat box. We have a fund that specifically supports the Environmental Stewards Program, and you can check out the website. You can check out all the information. I will put it in the chat box, but thank you for any support that you can give us. So, without further ado, after all of that, I would like to welcome our speaker, Today we have Bill Hlubik. He is an extension agent in Middlesex County. As I said before, he has worked for Extension for a long time. He is a supporter of our Everyday series. He spoke in the spring. You may remember your spring turf care, and now he's going to be talking about fall lawn and landscape care. But Bill has a family farm in Middlesex County. He practices what he preaches, and so we want to welcome Bill. So take it away, Bill.
Thank you very much, Amy. We're going to have a lot of fun tonight. We're going to talk about fall lawn care, and there's quite a bit to learn, and we're going to squeeze it all in the hour, and hopefully you guys will have some fun and learn something new tonight. And when I talk about lawn care, plant care in general, typically I start off by saying, what can nature teach us about plants? Because if we look to see where grasses and different types of native plants are adapted to the soil, to the light conditions, to different climatic conditions. That really tells us a lot about what those plants need. And in nature, we have this natural slow recycling of nutrients back to those plants. So they're growing at an optimal rate and therefore not as susceptible to disease and insect problems. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that matches with what we're trying to do with lawn care and landscape care in general today. And plants even grow at the top of some very difficult places like the top of Mount Washington, where we get winds over 200 miles per hour, and we still have different types of grasses growing up there and stabilizing the soil. So sometimes we'll even go out in these tough conditions and look for grass varieties to sometimes use for breeding because they're very tough and they can survive with very little soil and under the toughest climatic conditions. So our geneticists at Rutgers will go to these extreme locations to find plants that are adapted to extremes. And it's also important for anyone getting into plant care to understand that there are a lot of beneficial soil microbes, fungi, actinomycetes, and bacteria that are within soils. And if we keep the beneficial organisms healthy by providing plenty of organic matter and compost, we're going to also keep the plants healthy because there's this healthy balance and healthy recycling of nutrients back to the plants, and also build soils and build those beneficial microbes within the soil. So it's very important to have this balance, and that's why we take soil tests, which we'll talk about later, so we can keep that pH rate at 6 to 6.5 for many of our landscape plants, especially for turf grass. And that's really what keeps them healthy, is keeping a balanced pH and feeding plenty of carbon in the way of compost and recycling grass clippings right back onto the lawn. So when you see this, what's wrong with this picture? I can't see your guys' comments, but if anybody wants to chime in, and then maybe Amy or Steve can let me know what you guys are saying is wrong with this picture. So you can participate by using your chat box. Does anybody know what's wrong with this picture? Not just the fact that it's a little bit fuzzy, but what's going on there with that lawn? See any comments back from anybody?
Yeah, so Kathleen says it's all lawn.
All lawn, yeah. So in my neck of the woods, sometimes we have, people will have 2 and 3 and 4 acres of lawn to manage. And what's the matter with this lawn? Anybody know what the problem is with this lawn? When you look at that lawn, what's going on that's not correct with the lawn? And then in terms, also what's going on with the tree species there and plant species. Anybody have a comments?
Yeah, there's also a comment that there's no native plants and
Okay.
that the turf is too short.
Good, very good. Okay, great. You guys got it. This is a great audience here. So the turf is way too short. Typically, we're going to bring our mowing height up of turf grass to about 3 to 3.5 inches. And you're going to see that most of our cool season grasses just love to be mowed higher. They do much better. And sometimes when I tell people in the neighborhood and surrounding area, just that one change can make a huge difference in the health of their turf grass. So if they increase the mowing height here, add some native plants in there, include some diversity of plants from different families. So if you have a disease or insect problem, it's not going to take out the few plants that they have there. Also, they want to recycle those grass clippings back onto the lawn, which they do not do. And that's why that lawn does not look that great. Hopefully it's nobody's lawn that's on the program right now.
Yeah, so Larry did say no biodiversity. Just wanted to call that out too.
No biodiversity. Good, Larry, because that's exactly what's happening there. Now, if we look at what, what's realistic for our landscapes, what can we do, what should we be doing in our own landscapes? Well, history can teach us a lesson, because if we go back far enough, actually, it's not even that far, back in the 60s and 70s, most people actually did not mind clover being in their lawns. And that's because clover is very beneficial. Clover actually adds nitrogen back to the soil and recycles it back to the surrounding plants. So clover, especially white clover, is actually a good thing to have in our lawn. So people trying to get rid of clover might not be such a great thing. I think in the long run, we should start getting used to having clover in our lawn so we don't have to add as much fertilizer. Clover also helps us to break up compacted lawns, and in many cases over history, we had different clovers in our lawns, and not only did it help to break up the compaction in the soil, but it was able to grab nitrogen from the air and then share it with the plants around it. So clovers can actually be a very good thing. But clover and other types of plants, and especially weeds, are indicator plants telling us that maybe those conditions aren't optimal for turfgrass growth. So we may have some compaction issues, and the clovers will actually break it up, but some of the other weeds too will come in and take advantage of those compact soil conditions. So we'll talk about how we alleviate some of that compaction this time of the year through doing core aeration. So if you wanted to actually add clover to your lawn, you could use anywhere between 2 to 8 ounces of white clover per 1,000 square foot. And we would use Dutch white clover. We can use dwarf clovers. And many of us probably already have clover growing in our lawn. And in some cases, it's not necessarily such a bad thing. But if you wanted to establish it, you could. Normally, springtime is the best time to establish clover, whereas seeding lawns is usually done this time of the year because it's an optimal time, usually in the early fall, to go ahead and seed. Working with your site conditions is very important. If you don't have much sun, as in the case of this landscape, then you don't necessarily want to be growing turf grass. Or if turf grasses are going to come in, they're going to come in where there is a little bit more sunlight, and they're going to be the fine fescues coming in, because the fine fescues can survive under partial shade conditions. But we're going to want to grow other plants. If we have full shade, we're going to want to grow ground covers that are already adapted to those shade conditions. And we have fact sheets on our website at Rutgers Cooperative Extension where you can get a lot of information on the different types of ground covers that you can use and different shrubs and what have you that will be better for areas with low sun. But if we don't have a lot of sunlight, it's probably not a good idea to try to grow turf grass, because it will struggle. We'll have more problems getting it established and then keeping it healthy. And here you can see, as we go from a full sun condition into partial shade, we start to see the turf grasses disappear, and we start to see hostas and liriope and azaleas and rhododendrons really taking over in these areas where we have partial to full shade. And that's typically what's going to happen in those areas. So better to use plants that are adapted to the sun and soil conditions for those partially shady areas. So one of the things that we can do as environmentalists is really increase the organic matter in our soils and reduce the unnecessary overuse of fertilizers. So how do we do that? Well, we recycle grass clippings back onto the lawn, because that will provide anywhere from 30 to 40, and in some cases even higher, percentage of nitrogen right back to the turf grass, so that we can cut out maybe 1 or 2 applications of fertilizer on the lawn. We can also top dress lawns with about a 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch of compost. And if you have your compost dried out and you run it through a simple screen that you can build, then you can go ahead and use your spin spreader and just go ahead and put a little compost right on top of the lawn. And you can do that in the fall and in the springtime, but do just a little bit at a time. That helps to build organic matter and stimulate beneficial microbes in the soil. And it also helps us to retain moisture and retain nutrients where those plants need it, and will also help to stabilize the pH or soil acidity. And then around our trees and shrubs, we want to use just a few inches of compost and mulches to protect those plants, because remember, the most sensitive part of any plant is the root system. So we want to protect those roots and make sure they're getting adequate moisture, and they're protected from weeds growing around them. And we're also protecting them from extreme temperatures, high temperatures, or low temperatures. So increasing organic matter is extremely important, even in our vegetable garden. Where we start to increase organic matter, we'll start to see increases in production overall. So let's get right to it. Mowing, we want to keep the mower blade sharp, and we want to mow at 3 inches or higher. And there's no negotiation on that. If you start mowing lower than 3 inches, you're going to have problems. Because what's going to happen is your root system, as you see here, is not going to develop properly unless you let that grass get a little bit higher. And I know some of us like to mow lower because they think it looks neater, but in reality, it puts more stress on the intercalary meristem, or the growing point that's down near the base of that grass plant. So by mowing low, we actually stress out the grass plant. So we want to increase that mowing height if we want to increase the density of the turf grass and also increase the health of those roots. By doing this, we're going to reduce weed problems in the long run, and we're also going to shade the crown tissue of these cool season grasses when we have our hottest temperatures in August, and sometimes even this time of the year, it can turn right around and get very hot on us. And you can see here that root development is directly affected by the height of cut. So the higher the grass, and this comes from one of the research projects that we did, where we were looking at the root system development based on the height of cut. And you can see that root systems, as we cut higher, we have a more pronounced and developed root system, and also the crown develops better. It's also extremely important, if we want to reduce diseases on lawns, to keep our mower blades sharp and to use mulching mowers when we can, because mulching mowers have this two-level blade that you can see here. And if we keep that razor sharp, easy enough to change these blades out and sharpen them yourself, but that'll help these grass plants to heal very quickly. And it'll also reduce the amount of disease problems that we see on our turf grass. So it's very important to keep those blades sharp, and also take out any garbage that we see at the base of the mower. We want to keep that clean at the base as well. And when you do replace blades, make sure that you pull the spark plug out, pull the wire away before you do anything, so that that mower doesn't start automatically, and you could get hurt from that. So you can see here that if we cut the blades very smoothly, they're going to heal very quickly. We're not going to have problems with fungal diseases moving in. But if the blade looks like the one on the right-hand side, where it's chopped up, that's where we can get these fungal disease organisms moving in. So we can start to see some problems and become more problematic. So we want to keep the mower blades very sharp. And the best way to know when to sharpen them is just to look at the edge of the blade. It doesn't matter whether you have a 1/4 acre or 2 acres of grass, just to see how it's mowing. And if it's mowing smoothly, then you know that the blades are sharp enough. So it's extremely important that we recycle those grass clippings right back onto the lawn to provide 30% or higher more of the nutrients, especially nitrogen, right back onto the lawn. This is going to provide a great slow release source of nitrogen, as well as other micronutrients that the plant needs to stay healthy. And what we found in research, actually a colleague of ours, Dr. Joe Heckman, has found in his research that by recycling those grass clippings right back onto the lawns will actually stay green later in the fall and green up earlier in the springtime. No matter what fertilizer regime we add, it's actually better to recycle those grass clippings. And also remember that grass clippings do not contribute to thatch. So one thing that we can do as well, and we talked about this earlier, is go ahead and apply compost, well-rotted compost, to our lawns, and we can use these on vegetable gardens as well. Do you have a question there, Amy?
Yeah, excuse me, Bill. I have a couple questions. First, I want to ask, how often should you sharpen the blades?
So you sharpen the blade just by looking at the top of the turf grass blade itself. So if it's cut smoothly, then you know that the blade is sharp enough. But if you see that it's kind of tattered, like the blade I showed you before, like the one on the right there, then it's time to go ahead and sharpen up those blades. So it's really, so the indicator is how smoothly it's cut, the blades themselves.
Okay. And so then how often should you replace blades?
Well, that would be the same thing. And people are replacing or they're sharpening. You can keep sharpening blades until they won't hold an edge.
Okay.
I'll sharpen blades 8, 10 times or more. And unless I have some major damage to the blade, I'll just keep reusing the blade, because it's kind of a waste not to recycle and reuse the blades if you know how to sharpen them. You can use a sharpening stone, you can use a grinder, and if you look online, it's fairly easy to sharpen blades yourself. You just got to wear protective goggles. Be careful that you're doing it at the proper angle of inclination. But they're quite, and actually we do some workshops in the spring, which you're welcome to attend, where we do show you how to work on small engines and we show you how to sharpen blades. So if you're interested in learning how to do that to save some money, because I hate throwing anything away, I like to recycle everything that I possibly can. So here you see us. Any other questions?
Yeah, someone asked, what did you mean by grass clippings do not contribute to thatch?
So grass clippings break down very rapidly. Thatch is, as I will show you a little later down the slide line here, they are actually either crown tissue or root tissue that hasn't broken down, and it's this thick mat of material that's very high in carbon and lignin material. So that breaks down slowly, but grass clippings break down very rapidly. I mean, you may see them right after you mow and the next day, but usually within a day they're gone. They're breaking down very quickly. So whoever tells you that grass clippings are contributing to thatch really doesn't understand how quickly they can break down. And they're a very beneficial thing to just keep right on the lawn. The only time that you would take off your grass clippings is if you have been away and you haven't had a chance to mow the lawn. You come back maybe after a 2 or 3 week vacation, and then you need to take the lawn down a little bit at a time. Then you could go ahead and put those grass clippings in your compost pile. And then if you're mowing every 5 to 7 days, just recycle those clippings right back onto the lawn.
Okay. And wants to know a deer-resistant shade ground cover, and I don't know if you'll get to that later.
Let's hit that at the end.
Okay.
There's actually deer resistance is all relative, because if you're in an area like we are, where there are a lot of deer, they pretty much eat everything, even on our deer resistant fact sheet that we've developed at Rutgers. So it really depends on the population of deer. They tend to not like anything that's sharp to their tongue. So that's one way, or anything that has any prickliness to it.
Okay.
So
I'll post that fact sheet.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great.
And
so
then
here we see.
Here's a good segue for you. Is it best to apply compost to gardens and lawns in the spring, fall, or both?
Spring and fall are both good times. Spring is probably your very best time to apply, but you would only want to apply maybe 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 an inch at most at any one time. And typically I'll come in April and May and apply compost, and then again in maybe September and October and apply a little bit of compost if I have it. If you don't have a lot of compost, you can use peat moss. But once again, I like to use natural materials that I've created, so I like to use well-rotted compost. Here you can see that I'm screening the compost through a simple screen as well. And you don't need a fancy piece of equipment like you see here. You can just use your spin spreader. If you dry the compost down and you simply push it through that screen into your wheelbarrow, and then you go ahead and use your spin spreader, rotary spreader, you can go ahead and top dress your lawn. And then you can use 2 or 3 inches of this compost in your vegetable garden, or use it around your trees and shrubs as well. So here you see mulching can be a problem too. If we over mulch, it can actually starve plants, especially trees and shrubs, of oxygen. So we want to make sure we're not doing that. So like I said, when you're mulching around trees and shrubs, use a couple inches of mulch, but don't overdo it so that you end up causing problems for the tree or shrub. You can see on the right-hand side where we put just a little bit of mulch, that's perfect. A couple inches is good. But on to the left there, when you start to get that much mulch, you're going to cut off oxygen to the roots of trees and shrubs, and that's very bad for them. The tree will start to die out at that point. So one thing we can do this time of the year, and usually I start a little bit earlier, back in early September, is we can go ahead and do seeding or overseeding this time of the year. Now, before you do any overseeding, you want to mow the lawn closer. So that's the only time you mow the lawn closer. Actually, there's two times. When you're getting ready to seed or do renovation, that's when you bring the mowing height to about 1.5 inches. And that's because we don't want to tear up the turf grass. And if we're seeding, we want the seed to be able to penetrate down into the soil and have good seed to soil contact. And we want the sunlight to get to the seed so that we got good germination. So right before we do overseeding this time of the year, we can go ahead and mow to 1.5 inches first, and then go ahead and use an overseeder, which actually has a bin on the front, as you can see here. You can rent these machines, or you can go out and use a dethatching rake to open up some areas, and you can use that and then go ahead and top dress that with a little bit of compost or peat moss in areas where you're overseeding. And the next best time to do seeding, of course, the best time to do any seeding is in late summer, early fall. Spring is the second best due to weed competition. And you want to select high quality seed varieties that we recommend through the Rutgers, New Jersey Ag Experiment Station. So they're going to be different types of fine fescue and tall fescue, which we'll get to in a second here. So some of the best varieties for our area for low maintenance turf grass. And when I say low maintenance, I mean for areas that require less fertilizer inputs, less water input, are going to be the fine fescues and the turf type tall fescues. And the reason for that is that the fine fescues and turf type tall fescues have much deeper root systems. So when it comes to drought, these plants are going to be able to go much deeper into the soil to search out water and nutrients. Kentucky bluegrass is a little bit more shallow rooted, requires a little more nitrogen, and can be a little bit more to establish in terms of energy to get it established. Perennial ryegrass we tend to use more on sports turf or if we have to establish an area quickly, but perennial ryegrass is not necessarily the best low maintenance grass because it requires more mowing and oftentimes more management, but it will establish quickly in an area. And with sun shade mixes, you'll see that sometimes they put a little bit of perennial ryegrass in, a small percentage, just to establish the area, but they'll have more of these other grasses in as the final grass that will take over the area. A great place to go to get information, the latest and greatest information on our varieties that are available that we recommend through the experiment station, of course, is through the NTEP website, which is a National Turf Grass Evaluation Program. When you go to that website, you'll see maps. You click on the state, it'll give you the varieties and the testing areas that we have in the state of New Jersey. It will show the work that Dr. Bruce Clark and Dr. Murphy and many of our scientists are currently doing with varieties in our area, and also gives you the best of varieties that we've found over a period of time. So you can look for varieties with good green color in this area. They have high density in the spring or summer, so they're going to be able to outcompete weeds in our area. And green up just means that that variety will turn green earlier in the spring, so it'll give you extended season of color. And then we can also look for different varieties that have resistance to pest and disease problems. For instance, if they have endophytes in the grass seed, you always want to look for grasses that contain endophytes if possible. It can sometimes say it on the grass seed bag contains endophytes, or it will say Myco Advantage, MYCO. Endophytes are beneficial. We're actually going to talk about that in a minute, so we'll cover that in the slide, and I can show you what an endophyte is. But here's just a handful of varieties, and if you log on to our Rutgers websites, we have many more varieties to share. But one of our favorite varieties of low maintenance turf grasses are the turf type tall fescues. And many of these varieties, if you see any of these, the Rembrandts, the Rebel varieties, Millennium, Cochise, these are all great varieties, the Falcon varieties, Titanium, Mustangs. Any one of these is going to do well in our area and have done well on our research field trials. And you can see the ratings for these grasses when you go to that ntep.org website. So this is just a snapshot of some of the things that you can look for. And if you contact us, we'll send you a complete list of the turf grass varieties or the fact sheets. But the main thing that we want to remember from this is that fine fescues, especially the hard fescues, the chewing fescues, and the strong creeping red fescues, are much better for lower maintenance areas where we have low inputs of fertilizer. We're going to use less water. We want to mow less often. Also, the turf-type tall fescues are very good. And certain Kentucky bluegrass varieties are lower maintenance. So we have those on some of our fact sheets. What's really not recommended for low maintenance areas is perennial ryegrass because it requires more input. And some of the common varieties of Kentucky bluegrass require more nitrogen and mowing more often as well. So how do we reduce weed problems with sound cultural practice? Well, we encourage a nice, dense, healthy turf by using the right turf grass seed. So that's selecting the right turf grass, fertilizing at the proper time of the year. We typically will put down fertilizer in the fall of the year. Even if we're recycling grass clippings, one application of fertilizer is good this time of the year to help the turf recover, to help it build proper root systems so that it's going into the winter with really strong root systems so it can bounce back the next spring. We also want to reduce compaction using core aeration, which can be done this time of the year if we overseed right afterwards. Increase that mowing height. As I said before, that'll reduce weed problems. As a matter of fact, we've seen in some areas by just increasing the mowing height over time, we can reduce, if not eliminate, many of our weed problems as long as we've adjusted the pH and we don't have severe compaction problems. And also recycling grass clippings can help to build the soils as well as keep our turf grass much healthier. Any questions there?
Yeah, Bill, there's quite a few.
Okay.
What's the downside of reseeding or overseeding versus fertilizing? We live on a coastal area where fertilizers end up in the river.
Okay, so one of the things you can do, the first thing you want to do is really do a soil test to find out what your circumstances are, because if you fertilize and your pH of the soil is off, your plants aren't going to be able to absorb the nutrients that efficiently. So first off, you want to adjust your pH if you haven't already done that, so that the plants that are there can absorb any fertilizer you apply. If you're in a sensitive area, then you would want to grow something like the turf-type tall fescues or the fine fescues that require a lot less nitrogen, about half to 1/3 the amount of total nitrogen. Or you can grow varieties that are adapted to those particular conditions. If you have sandy, very sandy soils, most of the grasses we're talking about today are not going to be adapted to extreme sand environments. So there are other types of ground covers that you can use in those areas. Any other questions?
Sure. So there's a question about crabgrass. So if you don't want to use chemicals, should you completely rip up the lawn and start over?
Now, crabgrass is it's basically an annual weed that comes in, from seeds from the previous year. So if we increase the mowing height, we start to improve the soil. We're going to see crabgrass disappear over the next couple of years if you start to do everything right and you overseed and you adjust the pH. So if you want to completely avoid chemicals, just do the overseeding, using more vigorous varieties, adjust the pH, do core aeration and dethatching at the right time of the year. And by doing that, we can really start to reduce, if not completely eliminate, crabgrass in our area, because crabgrass really can't compete with fast-growing turf grass. So usually you have a compaction problem, or you have other issues, and that's why the crabgrass is coming in.
Okay,
So by improving lawn vigor, we can really decrease the amount of weeds right across the board that we're going to have.
Okay, so that actually leads into another question. Should you aerate before or after seeding?
Okay, so aerating before or after seeding. Basically, you would seed last. So you would do your aeration first, and then seed last, and then just drag something over the surface of that so that it just buries the seed a little bit. Otherwise, it's going to be like the Alfred Hitchcock movie where the birds fly into the area and just eat every last bit of seed that you put down. Seeding, but try to cover it over just a little bit after you've seeded. And if you've done aeration or dethatching, you're going to have some remnant material on the surface that you can kind of drag over that seed a little bit. Just be careful how you do that.
Okay, now some people would love to buy these grass varieties, but they don't know where to buy the seed.
Okay, so you can go on There are places like seedsource.com on the internet that you can look, and they will custom blend seed for you. And if you want, a certain amount of turf type tall fescue, and many times I recommend that people grow 2 to 3 varieties of that type of turf grass so that you have resistance there to different disease and insect problems. So don't just grow one particular variety. Typically, you want to match 3 or 4 varieties of turf grass in there in order to have that resistance. And so you can get these online. If you look around a little bit, there are seed sources online. Sometimes you can custom order from your local supplier, and they can. And if you look up on our website, we'll tell you what varieties to look for, and then you'll know exactly what to order.
Okay, then there's quite a few questions on different weeds. So stiltgrass, purslane, plantain. Are you going to get to those or?
We probably won't get to them in the whole hour. What I can tell you is like Japanese stiltgrass, if we're maintaining an area with regular mowing and turf grass, stiltgrass comes in typically where areas are not managed and they're not mowed on a regular basis. If you're mowing at 3-inch height and you've established and overseeded with good varieties of tall fescue or fine fescue, those grasses will be able to outcompete stiltgrass, especially if you've properly adjusted the pH to 6.2 to 6.5. So many of those weeds are going to go away just by proper management techniques and aeration and dethatching. And that'll get rid of 95% of those weed problems. So,
Okay.
so renovation can be done this time of the year. What it's going to do is it's going to increase aeration going to root systems, improve water and nutrient penetration down into the roots. Removing excess thatch means that if we have more than a 1/2 inch of thatch, and we can just simply take a knife or screwdriver or whatever, see how much thatch you have. And if you have more than a 1/2 inch, then it's time to dethatch. And typically we'll go in one direction and then go perpendicular to that. We set our dethatching blades. We can rent a dethatcher machine, or we can simply get a dethatching rake and rake out some of that thatch. And then right after we dethatch, we want to remove that thatch from the area, put that in our compost bin because that doesn't break down as rapidly as the clippings will break down. So you want to remove the thatch from the area and put that in your compost pile, and it will break down in your compost pile. And that way we can recycle that carbon and those nutrients right back onto areas where we need it again.
Okay, I'm
So
gonna
this
let
is
you. I'm gonna let you go.
okay.
We'll get to more questions later.
Okay,
Thank you.
sure. How much time do we have here? Okay, we're good. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is showing you the thatch areas where you have the grass blade, where it goes from green to whitish, and then below that is the crown tissue and the tertiary meristem, actually at the base, which goes into the root systems. And if there's thatch in between, that thatch layer is going to be in between the root systems in the soil. So that thatch layer can prevent oxygen from getting to the roots if it gets more than a 1/2 inch in thickness, can prevent nutrients, and it's almost like laying a layer of plastic in between the top portions of the grass and the root system. So that's why we need to dethatch periodically. And we would set that dethatching blade to go down and kick up a little bit of that soil when we're setting the thatch blade. So you want to not only kick up the thatch, but you want to bring a little bit of the soil to the surface, and that will help to break down the remaining thatch that's there. So here you see a type of machine that is typical to what you could rent. So what we do is first, before we do any renovation, we mow the lawn a little bit closer to about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. That's the only time we mow it that close. And then we go ahead and dethatch in 2 different directions typically. Then we'll go ahead and rake that thatch off, put it in our compost bin, and we'll go ahead and fertilize with about a 1/2 pound to 0.7 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square foot. And that helps the turf grass to recover. We'll do a light irrigation after that. And this can be done this time of the year. So, and then after that, if there are areas that are a little bit on the bare side, we can go ahead and overseed those areas and then maybe just cover it with a little compost after we've seeded it, just a very thin layer so that the birds don't get all of our seed. So that's something that can really help to rejuvenate some areas that we're having problems with. There's too much thatch, and we're trying to get oxygen and nutrients down to those root systems of the turf grass. Compaction's a real problem in some areas, and if we have never core aerated or dethatched for a while, then it may be time to really seriously look at that. And you can often tell because if there's water sitting out in the field, you know, and the area has, if it hasn't rained in a while and then you get a rainfall and it just sits in the field for a number of days, and we know we've got some drainage problems. And wherever we have wet, compacted, flooded areas, then we have to alleviate that water issue. Otherwise, we're going to have Pythium mold, other diseases moving in. It's going to be very difficult for us to grow healthy turf grass if we don't have adequate drainage. And so we need to alleviate that by doing core aeration. Sometimes we need to go in and actually set up so that the water flow is away from our yard and into a berm where it can catch it, but it's not in areas where we're trying to grow our lawns or our trees and shrubs that simply can't tolerate that much water. So watering, in terms of watering, some people are overwatering their lawns. Most lawns only need about an inch to an inch and a half of rainfall or irrigation per week. You want to irrigate early in the morning so that you can reduce these disease problems. And no matter what time of the year, you still want to irrigate super early in the morning and only when it needs it. Don't over irrigate and have those irrigation heads coming on when it's raining outside, because that will actually increase the disease problems. If we irrigate later in the day, we can enhance the amount of disease that we get on turf grass. So that's a simple solution for us to irrigate early morning only as needed, deeply but infrequently. And what that does is that forces those root systems to go deeper into the soil so that we don't have shallow roots. Here's a picture of a core aerator, and we can also do core aeration this time of the year. And these core aerators, they're nice because they can reduce soil compaction. What will happen is you will see these cores appear on the surface, and in this area, we can go ahead and put some compost down if we have compost, or we have some peat moss. If we need to adjust with lime to adjust the pH, that's a good time to put that material down, as well as fertilizer. And by core aerating, it helps to open up the soil, decompact the soil, allow drainage to occur. So if you've got hard, compact soils, core aeration this time of the year is really a worthwhile thing to do. And usually if you have heavy soils, if you have clay or compacted soils, you may have to core aerate every 3 or 4 years as needed, but just keep an eye on how compact that area is getting. Or if you see a lot of weeds coming in, usually weeds are an indicator that you've got a severe compaction problem if you're doing everything else right. So soil testing is extremely important. And you can do that this time of year because then it gives you time to add, you know, if you have to add lime to bring the pH where it needs to be, to bring that pH up. If it's too acidic, you add lime. If it's too alkaline or the pH is too high, then you need to use other materials, acidifying fertilizers or other materials which will actually bring the pH down to that 6.2 to 6.5 range. When you're doing a soil test, you randomly sample anywhere from 12 to 15 different areas, 8 to 10 inches deep. Put that in a bucket. There's 12 to 15 core samples. You want to remove any organic material that you see that's in there, and just have pure soil in there, so you don't have any grass clippings in there, or you don't have the base tissue of the grass plant in there, so you're going to just want soil in there. And then you go ahead and you mix that up in a bucket. Then you dry that out on, you can just put it on a tarp out on the sun. And then you put it in a pint bag and send that off to the soils lab, and then they'll give you pH and some macro and micronutrients. So this is a good time of year to do your soil testing. So pesticides cannot control all problems. Many times people want to reach for a pesticide and they haven't even identified the particular weed that they're trying to control, or whether or not it's a disease or insect problem that's at hand. Here we see this ring that sometimes will occur in certain areas. Well, if we look a little bit closer there and we wait a little while, we'll see mushrooms start to appear. And this is a fairy ring. So these fairy ring fungi actually can move out. And in some parts of the prairie, we'll see these huge fairy rings that can go out for thousands of feet. And sometimes you can even see them over miles of area where the mycelium just keeps moving out. What tends to happen is right where the mycelium are most active, the turf will start to die out, but then it'll return and come back again. So these type of things, this actually does not respond well to any fungicides. So it's not something we're going to control with fungicides. Basically, it's just a matter of masking the symptoms by adding a little bit of fertilizer and encouraging the organic materials to break down in that area where you're seeing the mushrooms appear. Plus, you want to remove the mushrooms that are on the outside anyway, so that no kids pick them up and start eating them. So for insect and disease control, anything, we want to properly identify the problem. If you don't know the problem at hand, then go ahead and send a sample into your cooperative extension office. And before we do any treating, we determine the problem at hand, determine the severity of the problem, determine if control is even needed, because for many of these problems, if we're doing everything we talk about today with proper fertilization, proper overseeding, mowing at the right height, we can withstand even high numbers of grubs like you see here, and the turf grass will be able to outgrow them. Question there, Amy?
So actually, I was wondering if I could start the poll, since
Go ahead.
we're about 10 minutes ahead.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Steve and I have been handling some questions, and we'll just leave some of these for later because you said you would get to them. But I'm going to start the poll. Let me bring that up. Everybody, make sure that you can see it. You may have to open the poll window in the bottom right. I see lots of
Bill, we may have lost Amy, so why don't you just pick up where you're going? But everyone, if you could please pick up, fill out the poll, that would be great.
Sure. Can you hear me, Steve?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. So endophytes are this beneficial fungus that actually lives in the seed of the grass plant, and then it starts to grow out into the sheath tissue or the top portions of the plant, and will actually inhabit, I should say, the seed that's growing on the surface as well. So we will actually buy seed with endophyte that exists within the seed itself. And then when we go ahead and plant seed that contains the endophyte, which you can actually see the mycelium growing through the sheath tissue on the microscopic slide on the top here, and actually in the seed itself below. So this beneficial fungus actually grows along with the plant, and it protects the plant, protects it from insect problems. And recently we found that in fine fescues, when we have endophytes, that we'll actually have protection from certain fungal disease problems as well. So it's a good idea to look for varieties of turf grass that contain natural endophytes or beneficial fungi. So you can see that not all fungi or bacteria are bad or cause disease. Endophytic fungi are actually very helpful. And the nice thing about the turf type tall fescues and the fine fescues is that many of the varieties that we grow now and the varieties that I was showing you earlier and that we recommend contain endophytes. So that's going to be an extra layer of protection for those grass plants, so we don't have to reach for an insecticide. So just a good tip, look for endophytes no matter what grass seed you're buying. So some cultural strategies for insect control is that we simply maintain sufficient soil moisture, because there are many natural fungi that occur within the soil that actually can help us balance out and control insect problems if we keep adequate moisture in the soil. We want to also avoid thatch buildup, so we want to prevent that thatch getting more than a ½ inch in thickness, and by periodically reducing thatch, we have less area that disease and insect problems can hide out over the winter and then reinfest our turf grass the following season. So go ahead and dethatch this time of year to reduce some of those problems. And then if we're using endophyte enhanced varieties, then we're going to have an extra layer of protection against many of our insect problems, especially surface feeding insects, and even a few of our disease problems. So to reduce diseases with sound cultural practices, we can simply keep the mower blade sharp. With trees and shrubs, prune out dead and dying limbs so that the diseased parts don't get into the main trunk of the tree. By properly watering turf grass, early in the morning. That's how we keep plants healthy, because then we don't have excess moisture sitting on those plants all evening, and we'll have a lot less disease problems occurring. And we can also reduce thatch problems, because many of these disease organisms are actually hiding out in that thatch, so dethatching this time of the year is an excellent idea. Reducing compaction means that we're have less stress on turf grass, so that overall we're reducing disease problems, especially foliar diseases. And even Pythium, and those diseases can be quite a problem when we've got compact soils and we've got water built up in those areas. And last but not least, take a look at those resistant varieties. Go to the National Turf Grass Evaluation Program, ntep.org, and you can find all the great varieties that we recommend that have resistance to many of these disease problems that we typically see. So what we're doing is basically utilizing all the tools that we can to have healthy turf grass by dethatching and core aerating this time of the year. We can put a little bit of fertilizer down. You never want to put more than 0.7 pounds of actual water-soluble fertilizer at any one time. And that will help that turf grass to bounce back and start to build up nutrients and reserves that it needs to come back strong in the springtime. Also, proper placement of plants, as we talked about earlier, putting them where they have the right amount of sunlight, the best type of soil, that we've adjusted the pH, we've taken our soil test. We're properly managing that area by mowing at the right height, by irrigating early in the morning, only as needed, and constantly getting education through programs like this, Earth Day Every Day. You can also join us this Thursday. We also have a Are You Ready to Garden program this Thursday night, which you're welcome to join that as well. And they're going to be talking about extending the growing season there. So join us this Thursday night. And here's a great vehicle for you if you're having that midlife crisis and you want a mower that and you can put your leather jacket on and go out there and mow the lawn in this nice lawn mower right here. This is a great one. So anyway, also just to let you guys know, if you have any questions, further questions, you can email me at hlubik@njs.rutgers.edu. We also are doing a beginner farmer program, and we have the Are You Ready to Garden on Thursdays that you guys can join us on. And I'm glad you're able to join Earth Day Every Day, because this is a great series. I'm happy to be part of this. Any questions out there, Steve or anybody?
Yeah, so thank you, Bill. I am back. Sorry that I dropped in the middle of explaining the poll. Just want to remind everyone the poll is still open. Please submit the poll. Don't forget to hit that. But as far as questions, Bill, where can you order beneficial nematodes from, and when should you order them?
Okay, beneficial nematodes should be put down typically the first and second week of August is the best time, but that can vary because of soil temperatures. But typically we say that that when we have our first instar of the grubs, that's the best time to put down the parasitic nematodes. You can order them online. There's biocontrol labs out of New York State. You can order them, and if you look online, I think we have a fact sheet that tells the different labs that are available out there at Rutgers. But you would look online and you would make sure that the lab that you're ordering those from has been verified or is endorsed by Cornell Cooperative Extension or Rutgers Cooperative Extension, just to make sure that you're getting viable nematodes. And you would order them about 2 weeks before you're going to put them down. So if you're going to put them down the first week of August, ordering them about a week or two ahead of that time. Keep them refrigerated, the nematodes, until you're ready to, not in the freezer, but keep them refrigerated. Then you would put them in a canister, spray it out over an area, usually that first or second week of August, and then you would water the nematodes in. Typically, you apply them later in the day and wash them down into the soil so that they swim down to where the grubs are.
Okay, thank you. Are ants bad? I have been taught that insects are good.
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on how many you have, and I typically don't necessarily control for ants. There's a reason that they're there. They're probably there's probably an old log or other wood materials that are breaking down in the area that they're making a home. So typically, if you want them to move away, then you have to remove the excess organic matter, depending on the species of ant that it is. but there's sometimes you can get them to move out of the area just by kind of rebalancing the type of plants you have in the area. Also by growing different types of plants, it can deter if you grow certain types of herbs from ants from even coming in an area. So look at, different other options that you have getting them to leave, but they're not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay, so keeping on the insect theme, we have bees that return every spring and burrow in our lawn. Since they are pollinators, we let them do their thing, but do you have any suggestions?
If they're not bothering you, then I would just leave them alone. There really isn't much that you're going to be able to do because the materials you're going to use to keep the bees out are going to hurt those bees, but also hurt many of other pollinators as well. So it's probably best just to, leave them alone. If you tend to have more clover, you're going to have more bees in the area in general. So maybe it's a balance in those cases if you don't want the bees around or you're allergic or whatever, but learn what kind of bees you have, because if they're ground nesting bees, they're not necessarily going to bother you as long as you leave them alone. So, and in some areas, just by mowing the turf grass higher and doing things like I talked about today, you'll have less problems. So.
Okay. So what type of fertilizer would you recommend for turf?
Okay, so normally we recommend a complete fertilizer that has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, unless your phosphorus levels are already high based on your soil test. And if your phosphorus levels came back from the lab at Rutgers saying that you had high phosphorus levels, then you could cut back on the center number. So with a 10-7-5, for instance, that's 10% nitrogen, 7% phosphorus, 5% potassium. So it's NPK, or nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So if we do need it, then we want to add a complete fertilizer this time of the year, and not to use, it doesn't matter what the fertilizer brand is. What matters more so that it's a slow release material, that it doesn't have sewage sludge in it. We don't want to use products with sewage sludge like Milorganite, because if we're going to ever use that area to grow food in, we want to try to avoid the use of biosolids in that area. If we're never going to grow any food crops there, you could use those materials, but we typically don't recommend it. But it doesn't really matter the type of fertilizer. Much of the fertilizer is coming out of the same plants anyway. Hopefully we don't have any fertilizer representatives listening to this right now. But and when you can, try to use organic-based products. You can really cut back and even eliminate your fertilizer use by recycling grass clippings, by using clovers, white clover in the mix, by mowing higher, by using turf-type tall fescues and fine fescues. I've seen that once you get past the first year and you have good establishment, many people can cut out fertilizer almost completely and have good-looking lawns, and then just periodically top dress with some organic materials like compost, and the lawn looks fine.
Okay. Did you fertilize with a product that contains weed preventers?
I typically tell our master gardeners not to do that unless, and the reason is that I don't recommend that you fertilize large areas with weed killers. If you do need to use a weed killer, maybe target the area where the weeds are the worst for that short period of time, and don't use it blanket, use it over a large area. So typically what I tell my master gardeners is use just a regular fertilizer, and then if you need to control weeds, spot treat the weeds where you need to, and use weed killers very sparingly. So the answer is no, do not use broad-based weed killers for the most part. It's not a good idea.
Okay. So Steve has been putting out some fact sheets, mole management, all kinds of things. So thank you, Steve.
Great, thanks, Steve.
Does it make a difference if I add grass seed that is different than what's already there?
Most of the time you're going to be adding grass seed with the new varieties that's not exactly the same. If you can match the type of grass, in other words, if you have bluegrass already and you want it to look the same, then you probably want to replace it with bluegrass. But if you really don't care and your lawn looks horrible and you're starting over, you're going to be using a lot of the newer type turf type tall fescues and fine fescues as your primary seed component. So over time, if you're overseeding anyway, you're going to start to shift over, and it really doesn't make a difference. Sometimes you will see a difference where you put in like some of the perennial ryegrasses, and you definitely don't want to use annual ryegrass because annual ryegrass will not last through the winter. It will die out if we get a cold winter. So I would probably stay away from the ryegrasses and lean more towards the bluegrasses and fine fescues and tall fescues.
Okay. What about dandelion control?
Okay, so dandelions are typically a sign that we have some compaction problems and pH problems. So if there are a lot of dandelions, then we may need to start over. And when I say start over, we may need to kill what's there by using a general contact herbicide such as Roundup, and then go ahead and clear off that area, clean out any material, and go ahead and reseed the whole area. But if you're just trying to spot treat, if you just have a few dandelions, don't get too excited about it. We could spot treat those dandelions with 2,4-D about the 1st of October. So this is a perfect time to just spot treat the dandelions at the top. They will take in the 2,4-D. So that means don't spray your whole lawn. Just go out there and periodically touch up where you just have the dandelions. You could also use materials like Roundup as well in those areas. And spot treat the dandelions directly. But then what it'll do, that will take that material in very effectively this time of the year and control the dandelions for the future. If you want to go with a non-chemical alternative, you could use a weed popping device, but you have to get most of the roots out because if you leave any of the root behind, you're going to have dandelions coming back in pretty strong.
Okay, then a very patient participant, Tom, who is an environmental steward, wants to know, how do you combat fungus now as the weather is cooling?
Okay, typically fungal disease problems are relatively easy to handle over a long period of time on lawns, as long as it's not something like Pythium. But even in the case of Pythium, many fungi are occurring because of the humidity and because of the stress on turf grass. So if we alleviate stress on the turf grass by core aerating, by adjusting the pH, by mowing it at a higher height on the grass, we're going to see that the fungal diseases won't be as problematic. And then when we overseed with some of the newer turf grass varieties, they have resistance to many of these fungi that attack the cool season grasses. So over time, just by doing the right thing, you're going to see less problems with fungal diseases.
Okay, now I have a very specific question here from Dennis. He says that his potassium in his lawn is very, very low, and no commercial fertilizer has enough potassium in it. So what would you recommend for low potassium?
You would just add a regular fertilizer that contains potassium, and over time, and then what you also will do is recycle organic materials. Like if you can use compost in the area, that's going to help to retain some of the potassium and recycle it. And you want to make sure you're recycling your grass clippings so you don't lose your potassium in the clippings as well. So just by recycling nutrients and adding a complete fertilizer, you're going to have enough recycling of those nutrients where you will be fine.
Okay, just a reminder to please submit the poll if you haven't already. I appreciate everybody filling that out. But I think we're pretty close to wrapping up here. I have another question. Any comments about removing fallen pine cones from turf and using them as mulch in landscape beds?
Pine cones will break down, but you probably want to grind them up a little bit if you're going to use them for mulch. I do tell people to leave their pine needles around the pines because they're actually the best mulch to keep around the pines to keep those plants healthy because they actually adjust the pH to rate where it wants to be around pines. So there's no need really to remove the needles. In terms of the pine cones, yeah, they're going to break down, but you could put them through your chopper or something else just to get them to break down that much faster if you're going to put them in your compost pile. Otherwise, they will break down. It's just going to take a little bit longer. What I do is I have an old lawnmower that I use, and when I have a pile of material that I want to chop up, I just run the old lawnmower over that and very quickly, and that does a good job of chopping up leaves or other materials that I want to put in my compost pile.
Okay, well, thank you, Bill. I've got a bunch of people commenting that this was an excellent presentation with so much great information. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome. It was nice to have everybody join us tonight. How many people did we have tonight?
So the most I saw was 86. I don't know
Okay,
if
great.
Steve saw a different number, but I want to thank Steve for helping moderate and manage the chat. And Bill, thank you. That was a very informative talk. And now your contact info is there. Please, if I missed a question or we didn't get to it, please contact Bill directly with your perf care issues. He's our expert here. But I want to thank everyone for joining us. Please submit your poll. I think it's actually getting close to being finished. But thank you so much for joining us. And we did put the link to our donation page a couple of different times there. So thank you for joining us. And next week, we will be having our fourth edition of this series. I forget what our topic is.
It's the wildlife defensive driving one for wildlife.
Oh, defensive driving to avoid wildlife. This is very timely because it's about to be deer mating season when they get a little crazy. So please join us. We have our Are You Wildlife Wise friends that will be joining us. And yes, please also join Bill with his Are You Ready to Garden webinar series on Thursday night. And I'll let him talk about that for a minute.
Sure. Yeah, if you want to join us October 1st, which is my birthday.
Happy
season
birthday.
Extension, yeah, thank you, is season extension for fall and spring gardens. And that's going to be a lot of fun. We have one of my students, Brendan Pearsall, who did a magnificent garden in his backyard, and he's going to be talking about that. You wouldn't believe the amount of produce that this guy got off of his backyard. It's unreal. And he just planted a bunch of our strawberries, and he's going to talk about planting some of our new Rutgers strawberries that are just being released this year. Also on October 8th, we're going to have Roses in Their Care with Donna Pemberton. And you can register right here with the links that you see. And if you forget those links, just reach out to me via my Hlubik at njs.rutgers.edu. And programs are an hour, just like this one. And thank you for joining us. And thanks, guys. Appreciate all your help tonight.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to stop recording. And